The hospital lights flickered faintly overhead, casting pale shadows on the floor as I sat in that sterile waiting room. The hum of machines and the occasional call over the intercom, the only sounds keeping me company. I had barely slept for 2 nights, pacing between the reception and the ICU, checking updates, talking to doctors, and signing off on forms I barely understood, my signature now shaky from exhaustion and worry. My father's heart surgery wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a desperate fight against time, and I had been the one who dropped everything, cashed out my savings, and stood by him when no one else even bothered to show up. It had all happened so quickly. One call from the hospital, one phrase, "Your father's had a major cardiac arrest," and everything else had gone silent in my world. I remembered rushing out of my apartment, the winter air clawing at my skin, my phone pressed against my ear as the nurse gave me rapid-fire details. I didn't even think about the money at first. My first instinct was to be there. The cost came later when I found out he didn't have insurance to cover the entire procedure. I didn't hesitate. I drained what was left of my emergency fund, maxed out my credit card, and wired the money before I even set foot in the hospital. When I walked into the ICU and saw him there, fragile and pale, hooked up to wires and tubes, I couldn't stop the tears from coming. He had always been this distant, almost unreachable man, a storm of silence and unresolved tension since my teenage years, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He was still my father. He was the man who had once taught me to ride a bike, who sat silently in the stands during my high school graduation, not clapping, not smiling, but still there. And that sliver of connection, that tiny part of me that still craved his approval, drove me to do everything I could to save him. The surgery was long and brutal. I waited through every hour with a knot in my stomach, alternating between hopeful prayers and soul-crushing fear. I called my stepmother Linda, but she sounded more annoyed than concerned. "I'm out of town with Chris," she said casually, referring to my stepbrother. "Just keep me posted if anything changes." That was the entirety of her concern. No offer to come. No question about how I was holding up. No promise of help. Just the same distance she had always maintained since she married my father when I was 12. I had never really gotten along with Linda. She had always made it clear I was more of an inconvenience than part of her newly constructed family. And Chris, well, Chris was her golden boy. 2 years younger than me, with a charming smile and an uncanny ability to always be in the right place at the right time. He'd been the one Dad had taken fishing when I got grounded for getting a C in math. He'd been the one who got the new car after graduation while I scraped by with a used Honda. But I tried not to let that resentment shape me. I told myself we were grown now, that the past didn't have to define how we moved forward. When the surgery ended and the doctor came out giving me the nod and soft words, "He made it," I nearly collapsed in relief. I had done it. I had saved him. I had given everything I had. And now he had a second chance. For a few days afterward, while he recovered, there was a softness in his voice I hadn't heard in years. He asked about my job. He even laughed once at one of my jokes. It felt like something was shifting, like the layers of frost that had built up between us were finally starting to melt. And I clung to that, even as I dragged myself back to work, juggling calls from the hospital and emails from my boss. The bills started rolling in after that. Lab work, medications, post-op care. I didn't mention any of it to Dad. I didn't want to make him feel guilty. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Still, I kept a quiet hope in my heart that maybe he'd see what I'd done, that maybe finally he'd see me. Weeks passed. He got stronger. I visited often, brought him meals, managed the nurse rotations, and even set up a home assistant for him. Chris visited once, for 15 minutes. He brought a bottle of wine and left before dinner. Linda swept in for an hour here and there. Her attention split between her phone and her complaints about the nurse's cooking. And yet, every time I visited, she looked at me like I was the outsider, the unnecessary fixture in a life that had been curated without me. It wasn't until a few months later that I found out about the will. It came in a thick envelope, sent by a law firm I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be a follow-up from the hospital, or maybe something related to his post-op treatment. But the moment I opened it and saw the words last will and testament, my heart sank. I didn't know what I expected, but I certainly didn't expect to read what I read. Everything. Everything. His house, his savings, his car, even his cherished watch collection had been left to Chris. Not a word about me. Not a sentence. Not even a footnote. I read the letter again, slower this time, looking for an error, a missing page, anything. But no, it was all there in legal black and white. My name appeared only once, in the acknowledgement section where he stated I was emotionally and financially independent, and therefore not in need of any provision. That line hit harder than any blow. Emotionally and financially independent? Was that how he justified it? That I didn't need him, and so he could pretend none of it mattered? I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope open beside my untouched coffee, and I felt something inside me unravel. All the nights in the hospital, all the tears, all the fear and sacrifice, all the unspoken love I had fought to preserve. And it meant nothing. He had watched me give everything, and in the end, he had chosen Chris. Again. Even from beyond the grave, he had picked him. I stared at the will for what felt like hours, numb, the letters blurring together as my eyes filled with tears I didn't want to let fall. It wasn't even about the money. God knows I'd never expected an inheritance. It was the deliberate exclusion, the erasure, the final verdict on a relationship I had fought so hard to preserve. He hadn't just passed me over, he had decided I didn't belong. And in that moment, every sacrifice I had made, every visit, every dollar I had poured into keeping him alive, felt like a cruel joke. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want pity or explanations. What would I even say? That the man I had saved didn't think I deserved to be remembered? That I wasn't even worth a gesture? I went to bed that night with a deep ache in my chest, and when I closed my eyes, I saw him lying in that hospital bed, gripping my hand, thanking me in a weak whisper. How could that be the same man who sat down with a lawyer and signed a piece of paper that left me with nothing? The next day, I called the law office. I needed to hear it from someone else. Some confirmation that this was real, not a mistake or a misunderstanding. A woman with a clipped voice and a tight accent answered and confirmed it all. Yes, the will had been updated 4 months after the surgery. Yes, your father was of sound mind. Yes, you are not a beneficiary. No, there is no letter, no explanation, no codicil. He said it was his final wishes, she concluded coldly, as though I were asking about someone else's father. As though I didn't have the right to feel hollowed out. I didn't tell anyone at work. I walked around like a ghost, pretending everything was fine while inside I was screaming. My closest friend, Eli, noticed something was off and kept asking if I wanted to talk. But I kept shaking my head. What would I even say? That my father had confirmed for the last time that I was never truly his? That everything I did to earn his love had been a waste? A week after receiving the will, I got a call from Linda. Her voice was as artificial as ever, syrupy and thin, like she was reading off a script she'd rehearsed too many times. I just wanted to check in, she began, and to see if you're, okay. I know this whole thing might have been a surprise. A surprise? A surprise, as though I had accidentally stumbled into a family dinner I wasn't invited to. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. You knew, I said, barely keeping my voice level. There was a pause. Well, your father had his reasons. He always said you were doing just fine, that Chris needed more support. Support, I repeated, like the word was some ancient code I had to decipher. You mean money? He needed money. Linda didn't deny it. Your dad loved you, But you've always been strong. You don't rely on anyone. That's not a bad thing. I nearly laughed, not out of humor, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. I had relied on him for love, for acknowledgement, for a space in his world. And he had looked at that need and turned away. You're calling me now because you feel guilty, I said flatly. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, her fake sweetness cracking. "I just thought we could... Look, you've got your life, and we've got ours. There's no point in stirring up old drama." Old drama. As if this wasn't the final page in a story written with years of silence and disappointment. I hung up without another word. Days passed, and the world moved on, indifferent to the storm that raged inside me. I avoided any mention of the will, dodging messages from extended family who offered their half-hearted sympathies or worse, tried to justify Dad's choices. "He probably didn't want to complicate things," one aunt messaged. "Chris always struggled, and your dad knew you'd be okay." Okay, I was not okay. I was raw. I was wrecked. I was more alone than I'd ever felt. Then came the invitation. It arrived on thick, cream-colored paper with an embossed gold edge. A celebration of life. A memorial service for my father. Hosted by Linda and Chris. Held at the same country club they used for Chris's engagement party last year, where I hadn't even been invited. I stared at the card, the perfumed envelope still clutched in my hand, and felt a cold fury begin to simmer in my chest. It wasn't just that they had excluded me from his legacy. It was that they wanted to parade their version of him without the messiness of his firstborn child. They wanted to tell a story where I didn't exist, where I was just a footnote in a chapter that had closed long before he died. I didn't RSVP. I didn't burn the card. I placed it on my mantle, right next to a photo of me and Dad from when I was 10. We were sitting on the edge of a pier, legs dangling, our fishing lines cast into the calm water. He was smiling, one of the few moments I could remember him doing so without restraint. I used to think that day meant something. Now I wasn't sure if it ever had, but something shifted in me. The grief started turning into something sharper. Not bitterness, no. I didn't want to be eaten alive by that. But a clarity. A kind of cold, painful truth I had avoided for years. That love, no matter how deeply it is felt, cannot be forced. That blood ties don't guarantee loyalty. That sometimes you can do everything right and still be left behind. I thought about writing a letter to Chris, telling him to enjoy the house I once helped paint when I was 17, or the collection of vinyls I'd bought Dad for his birthday, or the car I'd driven him to his checkups in. I imagined saying, "You can have all of it, but you'll never have what I gave him when he needed it most. You'll never have those nights in the hospital. You'll never have the look in his eyes when he woke up and saw I was still there." But I didn't write the letter. I didn't need to. I had already given more than anyone else ever would. I didn't go to the memorial. The morning of the service, I woke up before dawn, the gray light creeping in through the window like a whisper. I sat up in bed, holding the edge of the sheet, listening to the silence in my apartment. For a long time, I just sat there, unmoving, staring at the pale gold invitation still perched on the mantle. It looked absurdly elegant, too polished for what it represented. There was no place for me at that country club ceremony. Not in the white folding chairs, not in the slideshow, I was sure. Not in the speeches that would paint Dad as a generous, loving patriarch who had done the best he could. They would talk about his hard work, his wisdom, his golf scores. Chris would probably speak with a steady voice and glassy eyes, recalling some sanitized memory that made him look like a devoted son. Linda would wear something expensive and tasteful, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief she'd pull from her purse with a theatrical flair. No one would mention the man who lay in a hospital bed, clinging to life while I argued with billing departments, begged for payment extensions, and watched my bank account bleed out in real time. No one would mention me. Instead, I drove. I got in my car and drove north, past the edge of the city, through winding back roads lined with still bare trees. Spring hadn't arrived here yet. The air was sharp, the wind thin and cold. I drove without direction, letting the engine fill, the silence that had taken root in my chest. I ended up at a lake we used to visit when I was little. It wasn't a popular place, just a wide, quiet stretch of water surrounded by woods and worn-down picnic tables. I hadn't been here in nearly 20 years. The dock was still there, though the boards were warped and splintered now. I walked out to the edge and sat down, cross-legged, watching the ripples spread across the surface. I pulled the photograph from my jacket pocket, The one from the mantle. Me and Dad on this very dock. I must have been 10 or 11. My face, round, sunburnt, squinting into the light. He was holding a can of soda in one hand, the other slung around my shoulder, his smile small but real. I used to stare at that photo and think, this is proof. Proof he loved me, even if he didn't know how to show it. Proof that beneath the silence, the distance, there was something solid. Now I didn't know what it meant. Maybe it was just a good day, a fluke, a single drop of warmth in a cold sea. I held the photo tight and let the grief come. No fighting it, no pretending I'd made peace. It came in waves, raw, guttural, full of all the things I'd never said. The hurt, the longing, the helpless hope I had carried like a stone in my chest for years. I cried for the little kid who waited by the window on weekends, hoping Dad would pick him up like he said he would. I cried for the teenager who tried too hard, studied too hard, hoping maybe being perfect would be enough. And I cried for the adult who had sat by his hospital bed and believed, truly believed, that this time it had changed. I stayed there for hours. By late afternoon, the sun had warmed the lake, casting soft gold onto the water. I skipped a few stones across the surface like we used to do. My hand ached. My chest still felt hollow. But I could breathe again. Over the next few weeks, I started pulling away from everything connected to them. I blocked Linda's number. I deleted Chris's half-hearted email that said, "Hope you're doing okay. You know this is what Dad wanted." I didn't need closure from either of them. I didn't want their explanations or their guilt. I didn't want to be part of the neat little lie they were telling themselves. What I did want, what I needed, was space to rediscover who I was outside of him. Because for so long, so painfully long, I had shaped my life around proving myself to a man who had already made up his mind. I went back to therapy. I told my therapist the truth, how much it still hurt, how much I hated that it hurt, how I wished I could just be angry and done with it. But love is never that clean. It clings even after it has shattered you. And maybe that was the worst part of it all. One night, I sat on the floor with my laptop and pulled up an old file. One I hadn't touched in years. It was the start of a novel I'd been working on before life got in the way. Before Dad's surgery, before the will. It was about a boy who runs away from home and ends up building a new family from the people he meets along the way. I started typing again. The words came slowly at first, then faster, until they poured out of me like a tide I'd been holding back for too long. I wasn't writing about Dad, not exactly, but I was writing about healing, about loss, about finding something worth holding on to after everything else has fallen apart. There was a freedom in it, a quiet kind of power. A month later, I visited the cemetery. I hadn't planned to. I hadn't even wanted to. But something pulled me there, a final knot that needed to be untied. The plot was neatly maintained, a modest headstone with his name and the dates carved cleanly beneath it. There were a few fading flowers in a vase, probably Linda's. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to say. There was no final monologue, no dramatic goodbye, just the sound of the wind through the grass and the weight of everything, left unsaid. Finally, I whispered, "I forgive you." Not because he deserved it, not because I wanted to absolve him, but because I needed to let go. I needed to stop carrying him inside every wound, and I turned and walked away. In the months that followed, life didn't transform overnight. It unfolded slowly, like a wound learning how to heal without a scar. The pain didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became quieter, less sharp. There were still days I woke, up with the heaviness in my chest, wondering if any of it had been real, wondering if he had ever seen me the way I saw him, someone worth fighting for, worth remembering. But I began to build a life that didn't orbit around that question. I moved to a new apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but it had big windows, and a little balcony where I could sit with a book or a cup of coffee and watch the sun break over the skyline. I filled the place with pieces of me, shelves stacked with novels, photos of friends who had stayed when everything else fell apart, small trinkets from places I'd always wanted to visit, and finally had the courage to see. One of the biggest, changes came unexpectedly. Eli, my friend, the one who had quietly stayed by my side through the worst of it, asked me one day if I wanted to come with him on a trip. No reason, no plans, just to get away. We ended up in a quiet coastal town where the streets smelled like salt, and the nights were filled with laughter from strangers we'd never see again. One night, sitting by a fire on the beach, he looked at me for a long moment before asking, "Do you think you'll ever let yourself belong somewhere?" The question cracked something open. I had spent so long trying to belong in places I was never invited, so long trying to make a home in someone else's silence. And now, for the first time, I realized I didn't need to fight for space where I was never welcome. I could build my own. I began volunteering at a community center, not because I needed something to do, but because I wanted to surround myself with people who were building lives from the ground up. People who showed up, who gave without expectation, who listened without judgment. I found something in that space I hadn't felt in years. Not forgiveness, not closure, but connection. It was in the small things. A teenager asking me how to write a college essay. An older woman teaching me how to make bread from scratch. A child offering me a crayon drawing that looked nothing like me but made my chest ache with joy. These moments were tiny, but they were mine. Eventually, I sold the few things I had left of Dad's. A watch, a sweater, a book he'd once scribbled a note in. Not out of spite, but because I realized they didn't carry the love I'd hoped they did. They were just things. Echoes of a story I no longer wanted to relive, but I kept the photo. Not because I believed in the version of him it showed, but because it reminded me of the boy I had been. The one who had loved fully, without conditions. The one who had waited, tried, fought. That boy deserved to be remembered. Not for his pain, but for his heart. Chris reached out once more, a few weeks after the estate had officially closed. He sent a message saying he hoped we could be civil, that families shouldn't hold grudges. He even offered to split a few things from the house if I wanted. I read it once, then deleted it. I didn't need things. I didn't need his guilt. I needed distance. Because what I had now was more than I'd ever gotten from them. Peace. I wrote again. A lot. Pages and pages of fiction that weren't really fiction. Stories about people finding their way back to themselves, about breaking cycles, about letting go of the ghosts that haunt their family trees. The novel that had once been a forgotten file became a living thing. I kept writing even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. And one day I realized I didn't think about the will anymore. Not with anger, not with grief. Just as a turning point. A marker between who I had been and who I had become. The truth is, sometimes we don't get the apology we deserve. Sometimes the people we save won't remember us in their will or in their hearts. Sometimes they'll write us out and never look back. But that doesn't mean we're forgotten. It doesn't mean what we did didn't matter. It doesn't mean our love was wasted. Because in the end, I still showed up. I still held his hand. I still fought for him when no one else would. And that, no matter what paper he signed, can never be erased. That was mine. And I took it with me into the life I built. A life where love isn't earned. It's given freely to people who see you, choose you, and never let you forget that you belong. Not because of blood, but because of truth, because of heart.